for it.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jason Copping, the Minister for Labour and Immigration, and I thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased to be here with Premier Kenney and Mohamed Yassin, our Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration, and Dimitrios Nicolaides, our Minister of Advanced Education. As a member of this government, I am honoured to have been trusted with the immigration portfolio. Immigration is not only an important part of our history as a province, it is also critical to our future. We are blessed to live in a land of opportunity that attracts the world's best and brightest to contribute to our society, life, and economy, and some of these people are behind me right here today. And we will be introducing exciting changes for newcomers to this province, changes that will reduce red tape, reignite our economy, and get all Albertans back to work. And this is part of our platform commitment to implement the Alberta Advantage immigration strategy. Today, I had the honour of taking the first step on delivering on Government Fairness for Newcomers plan by introducing the Fair Registration Practices Act. This legislation will enable government and professional regulatory organizations to work together to ensure that registration practices are transparent, objective, impartial, and fair. And we will achieve this by, first, establishing a Fair Practices Code that outlines the elements of fair registration, creating a Fair Registration Practices Office, and finally, working with regulatory bodies to streamline processes for the timely recognition of credentials to get newcomers working as soon as possible. It is no surprise that this legislation is being introduced in the first 100 days of a Jason Kenney-led government. Premier Kenney has spent more than a decade making life better for immigrants at the federal level, where he focused on creating a system that served new Canadians and our country's economic interests. He combined smart policy making with dedicated community outreach to clear backlogs, shorten wait times, and help skilled workers get to where they were needed most. And now, as Premier, he and this government are working in new ways to make life better for newcomers here in Alberta. And the Premier is here to explain how that will happen. Please welcome Premier Kenney.
Thanks very much, Jason.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you, Jason and Mohamed, Dimitri, and especially to the folks who just shared their experiences with us. Canada is blessed, and Alberta is so fortunate to be the home to so many newcomers, bringing with them their talents, education, and experience that we need for our future prosperity. But too many of those newcomers end up facing unemployment and underemployment in Alberta because they can't get their education, credentials, or work experience recognized. That means we take a lot of people from the top levels of their societies where they're constructively working, often as professionals, too often to face underemployment, stuck in survival jobs just to put food on the table for their families, while their skills atrophy, and while often we face skill shortages in the very professions they came here to work in. This is a huge economic loss for us. It's a huge opportunity cost in terms of our prosperity. But I also believe that this phenomena of, quotes, doctors driving cabs, it's also immoral. It's unethical for us as a prosperous, developed society to invite people with the highest qualifications and experience to come here only to face that frustration, that professional frustration that often turns into emotional and family challenges as well. I've met so many newcomers who felt like they were cheated, quite frankly, by their experience, that Canada recognized their degrees and credentials, their work experience for purposes of the point system of selecting economic immigrants. But then when they actually went to apply to get to work in those professions, as we heard today, too often are unable to do so. We heard, for example, the story of Jacqueline here, who for 25 years worked as a medical doctor overseas, but who tried to get through this, the endless barriers and the hoops of the system in Alberta, unsuccessful, and ultimately had to go through a diploma program to work in an administrative job in a medical clinic, being surrounded by doctors who have comparable training, but she's not able to care for patients, even though that's her vocation. We heard from Mohamed, who came here as a refugee from Syria, who highly experienced appliance technician, unable for years to go to work at that skill, which is much in demand, had to jump through endless hoops. people who have had to give up their professional dreams and lose years of education and, in some cases, decades of experience. That's why, in the recent election, we committed to implementing a Fairness for Newcomers action plan, which begins with today's introduction of Bill 11, the Fair Registration Practices Act. This basically creates a legal framework to compel the licensing bodies that control access to our professions to give a fast and fair process for newcomers. Now, let me be clear. The goal of this law and our Newcomers Action Plan isn't to lower the Canadian professional standards. We want to maintain our world-class standards. But the point is to ask, nudge, and ultimately, if necessary, compel the regulatory bodies to apply those standards in a fair and fast way. And so it creates a 6-month time, is it 6 months for the initial stage?
Yeah, 6 months.
6-month initial stage timeline to get back to the newcomer. If the answer is that, no, you're not qualified, you need to take additional training or do additional language training, for example, then let people know that as soon as possible. In fact, we want to also work within the context of our action plan with the federal government to provide additional pre-arrival orientation so people can begin applying for credential recognition and jobs before they get here. This bill is based on best practices across the country, including in Ontario, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. So Minister Copping and his team have looked at their analogous legislation to come up with something that will work best in Alberta. This will also lead us towards the Premier's Summit on Fairness for Newcomers, where I will invite some of the folks we just heard from and their, frankly, tragic stories in too many cases. We'll also invite all of the professional licensing bodies, employer groups, and immigrant settlement organizations to a provincial summit to throw a spotlight on this issue and to demand action with a sense of urgency. We're also setting up, in part through this legislation, a Fairness for Newcomers office. It will be supported by new funding. I've asked Minister Copping to I will, as the Premier, be putting this issue on the agenda of the national agenda. I will be leading a discussion at the Council of the Federation in Saskatoon a month from now on how we can work together better as provinces in accelerating foreign credential recognition. And we will ask the federal government to renew its action plan in this respect to provide better assistance to newcomers who, in many cases, the federal government selects. We will expand the work of the International Qualifications Assessment Service that currently exists in the Alberta government. We will expand access to microloan lending programs to help newcomers take additional training. If they have to keep doing the survival job and they're depleting their savings, but they have to pay for certification exams or do supplementary training, that sometimes the cost is too much. They don't have the high credit rating in Canada. This is something we want to help to create a bridge, as well as supporting bridging programs so that physicians, for example, could at least be trained to work as paramedics, and people can work in similar professions to prevent the atrophying of their lifetime skills. As I say, we'll work with the federal government to offer pre-arrival orientation to selected economic immigrants coming through the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program. All of this part of our Alberta Advantage immigration strategy. Minister Copping knows that I'm watching this very closely. This is something about which I am deeply passionate, and I'm even more passionate today, having heard many of the profoundly frustrating stories from some of the folks standing behind me. And I want to thank them, A, for having chosen Canada, and B, for not having given up on us, even though they ran into a lot of barriers. Some very courageous people behind me here. And we want them to know that at least the provincial government is going to do everything it can to knock down unnecessary barriers, to be champions for their full economic inclusion. I'll hand it over to Mohammed, then happy to take your questions.
Oh, thank you, Premier Kenney, for your kind remarks. I was once a newcomer to this province. I moved here when I was 17 years old. Alberta gave me the opportunity to work hard and enjoy the level of prosperity I didn't even think of in the beginning of my career. I have truly lived the Alberta dream. That's why it was such a privilege and honor for me to be named the first Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration in Alberta. Our government recognizes that much of our province's strength comes from its diversity. That's why we have emphasized our commitment to ensuring newcomers have opportunities to learn, grow, and prosper, just like I did many years ago. As we just heard, this legislation will go a long way toward eliminating barriers. We begin to deliver on our Fairness for Newcomers action plan. I look forward to meeting and working with newcomers all across Alberta, and as we continue to make this the best place in the world to live, to work, and raise a family. We now invite you to ask questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mom. Good job.
Thank you.
Minister, 2 questions if I may. Just over here. If it all comes to pass, when would you like to see this up and running?
So we've left some flexibility in terms of the proclamation date. Our intent is actually to work with all the regulatory bodies to actually make sure they can meet the 6-month deadline, and also, you know, the code that we have, sort of the newcomers code, to make sure that they have all those elements. And so, you know, our intent is actually, you know, hopefully, you know, within this year, but we need to work with all the other regulatory bodies, and then we'll proclaim. Yeah, we haven't had a hard and fast date, but we expect, yeah, in that range.
The Premier referenced you might be getting some pushback. I mean, what are you gonna do if some of these bodies just frankly don't play ball? They don't, I mean, you can issue orders, there's a $50,000 fine, but what, if anything, can you do if you get pushback from one agency all the way down the line? They won't do it.
So our intent is, just let me step back for a second. Like, this is enabling legislation, and our intent is actually to work with the regulatory bodies to actually implement this. And quite frankly, we've had conversations with a number of them. We had a phone call with, you know, a large number of them today. They're all generally supportive of this, and we have a range of organizations. Some organizations on one end of the spectrum, they're doing this already, and we have a couple of those organizations behind us right here today. Others, you know, not so much. And a lot of them tends to be the smaller organizations who just haven't taken the time, because this is truly about good governance. And then we have a series of steps. You know, we'll work with you, we'll send orders, you know, there actually could be fines. But we believe that we can actually move these organizations along the path. And at the end of the day, they are creatures of the state. And in addition to having this act, we have other tools at our disposal. But at the end of the day, you know, but I first want to say, our intent is to work with these organizations because it's better for all of us. Right. You know, and I echo the Premier's frustration. I'm a human resource person. That is my background. And the reason why we bring in a number of these immigrants, right, those skill sets, is we have a shortage of the skill set. And we need this because we haven't, in terms of our education, you know, it takes time to actually get people educated into the workforce. We have a need now, and that's why not only the federal government, you get points for that, but then we nominate them through Alberta to actually come here for this particular skill set, and now they can't hit the ground running. And that's not an impact only for them. That's an impact for us, because we need these human resources to grow our economy, and we can't get them working right away. So we think that the organizations will want to work with us. They are creatures of the state, and we have tools in here to work with them and be able to get there. And if that's not going to work, we can use these tools, and there's others available to us as well.
I could supplement that, because Jason's the good cop. I'm going to be the bad cop here. So, exactly. There's way too many of us here. So there are fines available here if regulatory bodies don't comply with the standards we're setting out in the legislation. But I want to remind the professional bodies that they are all creatures of the legislature, and with the power that they have been delegated by the legislature comes a commensurate responsibility to exercise that authority responsibly. And so we hope, and as Minister Copping said, that we'll get buy-in from all the professional bodies. However, there is a spectrum of conduct when it comes to fairness for newcomers. There are some of the bodies, a couple of them here, that have been very progressive, have worked really hard to streamline their procedures and to follow best practices and to give a fast answer. There are others that may be engaged in gatekeeping practices designed to restrict access to their labor markets, their discrete labor markets. And the part of this policy is to be able to measure how well the professional bodies are doing, okay? And if we get into this in a year or two from now, we see that there are some professional bodies that are abusing their authority to erect unjustifiable barriers to registration and certification, then I will be prepared to remind them that we could de-designate them and create new regulatory bodies in their place. Ultimately, I am prepared as Premier to use the legislative authority that we have to ensure that these professional bodies act responsibly. So this is, and that's something I will be conveying to them very directly and publicly at our Premier's Summit for Fairness for Newcomers.
Premier, I have a question for, or Minister, whoever wants to answer.
He's the technical guy.
I just want to ask, we heard about from the department that there's some stories around that, there's some delays and stuff, but, for the most part, 6 months interim decisions get done. My question is, why not set this office up so that it deals with individual cases specifically, or have a wing of the office that deals with that? Just curious to understand your thinking there.
Well, if you look at the bill, right, and this is enabling legislation, right, and we did set up the office to be able to be used as a portal and communication out to the immigrant community, and then also working with the regulatory bodies. But there's over 60 of these regulatory bodies, so having an expert to actually answer individual questions, right, is very difficult, because you have different steps for each of these regulatory bodies. But the purpose of the office will be as a portal, so that, one of the purposes is, so if you have an individual, and we heard lots in the stories today about, we want to know what our plan is, where can we go to, how can we start this? And to the point that the Premier made already, is that we actually want this portal to be out so that even before newcomers come here, right, while they're on the list and they're waiting to come here, they can go through our portal, understand, okay, this is the organization I need to deal with, and then we would work with the organization, make sure that they have a clear path forward. So the reason is that we got so many organizations through. Our objective is to create the portal, and it's up to the regulatory bodies who are doing this to actually, and us working with them, so they have a clear path forward that they can communicate on an individual basis.
When it comes to this system, though, I mean, I've been through the immigration myself. It can be hard to know.
Are you certified as a journalist?
That's right. Very professional organisations, but it can be hard to know, right? You don't know who to contact. You don't know how to contact them. You don't know what rules are in place. You don't know who to contact in government. Is there any thought to perhaps putting the onus on the office or on regulatory bodies, saying, you know what? If things don't go correctly, you can complain, and here is that, and actually making them be proactive in terms of delivering information to newcomers or potential newcomers?
Yeah, so part of it is the act is, the requirement is that they be transparent and they have a fair process, and part of it is also, they also have a transparent appeal process within their own organization. Our intent is actually not to change the standards, we need to maintain the standards, but it's to make sure that they have these processes in place, and then we have a portal to be able to link people who actually have questions to them to be able to do that.
Getting to the question of barriers, is it, how much of it is gatekeeping, as the Premier indicated, and how much of it is maybe a lack of resources, perhaps, to evaluate skill sets and credentials?
So it's a combination of both, from what I understand. You have some organizations that are doing gatekeeping. You have other organizations, and especially the smaller ones, where they just don't have the resources. They're smaller organizations. They don't have the resources to do this. And so that's one of the reasons we have the office and funding for the office, to be able to work with them to build good governance and build those processes and do it in an efficient way. And much as that is online. So again, we set ourselves for success so we can actually reach back for the people who are coming outside the country, right, who can go through our portal, go directly there, and actually start the process earlier so they know what the path forward is.
We're going to go to the phone. Just one sec. Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
No questions from the phones at this time.
Okay, go ahead, Kieran.
Premier, you sort of laid out what'll happen if one of these regulatory bodies has kind of followed through on this kind of thing, and you kind of have some strong language there. I'm wondering if you're concerned, or if you have any contingency plans for if all of a sudden a regulatory body just starts like throwing people through, and it can have like a flip side effect,
Fair enough.
right? Is there anything?
Well, no, fair enough. Look, these professional bodies are designated by the government of Alberta on the condition that they maintain adequate professional standards. We're in this legislation adding another condition, which is that they provide a reasonable pathway to credential recognition. We want so there's a balance. Obviously, once again, we do not ask nor expect them to lower the Canadian standard. That would be unacceptable to both the government and to Albertans, and quite frankly, unacceptable to newcomers. They're not seeking to lower the standard. They're just saying, look, I'll give you an example. I had a constituent, Calgary-born kid, who did his medical degree at Johns Hopkins in Maryland, the top-rated medical school, I think, in the world. Came back to Alberta and was told by the college that he'd have to redo his residency all over again in order to get a license to practice. He said, forget about it. Went back to the United States. We lost one of the best trained doctors you could get anywhere in the world. And so in his case, it's not about, and so many of these other cases, it's not about the standard of training and the quality of their foreign education. It's about practices that just don't give them a fair shot. And so,
Sorry, how would the bill change that story that you just told?
En français?
Non, ben, les deux langues, si vous voulez, mais
Well, the bill would make it, the bill imposes a statutory requirement on all of these professional bodies to provide a fair process according to certain now legal principles and a 6-month timeline in the initial assessment. So bottom line is this: if you're the registrar of one of these regulatory agencies, you now know that all of your power is contingent on complying with this approach of fairness for applicants with foreign training and education, and that we're watching you, and that you're accountable on that. So it creates, I think, it compels the professional licensing bodies to take this seriously. Some have already been doing this, and I give them great credit. Others, not so much. This raises the stakes in a very legal way.
who decides that the decision?
Well, ultimately, the minister. Ultimately, the minister is designated as the authority to apply the bill to the licensing bodies.
That's correct. Yeah, so it's at the end of the day, it's the minister, and we're setting up an office, so they'll be within the department. But again, that reports to the minister, and we'll be working with the parliamentary secretary in that regard.
Est-ce que vous voulez une petite sommaire français?
Une explication.
Oui.
Ce médecin, on lui dit, refaites votre résidence. Qui décide que ce n'est pas juste? Who decides it's not fair to ask him to do that again?
À la fin, ça serait le ministre, mais selon le conseil, l'avis des fonctionnaires, évidemment, c'est un bureau que nous créons qui sera là pour faire l'analyse de comportement de toutes les agences professionnelles. Et à la fin, ça serait la décision du ministre. Mais pour une petite sommaire en français du volet du projet, c'est aujourd'hui nous lançons un projet de loi pour s'assurer l'équité, la justice pour les immigrants quant à la reconnaissance de leurs acquis. Parce qu'on a trop des nouveaux Albertains avec les niveaux d'éducation bien éduqués qui travaillent bien, qui ne peuvent pas obtenir leurs acquis par des agences, des ordres professionnels en Alberta. Alors, aujourd'hui, nous proposons ce projet de loi 11 pour mettre une obligation sur les ordres professionnels de reconnaître les compétences des nouveaux arrivants de façon juste et équitable. Ça, c'est le but. À la fin, le ministre sera responsable, mais ça met une responsabilité sur les ordres professionnels d'agir de façon responsable.
We have a question on the line. Operator, can you put through the first caller?
First question is from Rick Bell with the Calgary Sun. Rick, your line is open.
Good afternoon. It's a question for Premier Kenney. Minister Morneau was in Calgary this morning and was asked more than once in a press conference about how he would deal with Albertan and oil patch skepticism when it comes to the Trans Mountain Pipeline actually being completed. And he answered that he would get, the proof is in the fact that they're going to get on with the work. He vowed to persist with the pipeline. I'm not sure that goes far enough. What do you think Albertans need to hear concretely from the federal government to instill confidence in Albertans that this particular project will actually be completed if and almost certainly when there is pushback during construction?
I'd like to hear from Minister Morneau and Prime Minister Trudeau that, very simply, it will get done. Perhaps they could borrow a phrase from former Prime Minister Martin when he underscored his commitment to balancing the federal budget in 1995, when he said, it will get done come hell or high water. That's the kind of determination we'd like to see to this nation-building, job-creating project.
Do you have a follow-up, Rick?
Yeah, well, he did say to us that he would persist in it, but didn't really offer any details about what would happen if the people you referred to as that tiny minority obstruct the pipeline. Do you think he should be at least a little more concrete with Albertans about his determination to push this thing through if there is pushback?
At the end of the day, what matters, Rick, are actions, not words. We appreciate the decision of the federal cabinet yesterday, and we will be encouraging the federal government along every step of the way to get this thing done, to start construction immediately. They own it. They've got to build it. They've made a decision to do so. We have to have confidence that will happen. And certainly, I think the opposition to this isn't disappearing, but I think it's shrinking. We can see it in the polls. We see more and more First Nations signing on to be partners. And I think that at the end of the day, the folks who try to resist our country's economic progress and unity are on the losing side of history. With that, folks, I'm late to chair a cabinet committee meeting, so thank you very much. I want to thank our guests here especially.
Thank you so much.